Haven't done anything yet. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk and present some of my work today. And thank Madeline and Gabe and the organizers for doing such a great job setting us up and working to host us so nicely. So I greatly appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about network methods for behavior change and network interventions. I've got an hour and way more than an hour to say, so I will try to move somewhat quickly. This is the outline. I'm going to talk about network influences on behavior, and there's a reason for that, and then interventions, program implementation, diagnostics, and different network measures. So don't have to convince anybody in this room. Using networks to understand behavior and why people change is important for a whole lot of different reasons. And what I'm going to present to you is some work that I just published last year in Connections on thinking about contagion versus interpersonal influence. And this has been a sort of a, Jim alluded to a bunch of this yesterday. This has been a bee in my bonnet for a while because I think we actually get very lazy by saying contagion. It makes us feel smart and it makes us feel like epidemiologists. But we actually don't study contagion. We study interpersonal influence. And we have words and terms for that. So I have a sort of stylized ego network here with 6 alters, and of course we know that exposure is associated with adoption, and this is the contagion analog and the one that we have. And curiously, we've actually, the first time that this was ever done was in Rogers' book in 1981, and it was actually done by Bill Richards. And even though the Coleman, Katz, and Menzel study argued for a contagion effect, it in fact was not there. So yes, as your network fills with users, you're more likely to become a user. And we also know that if you perceive alters to use, that is also an influence on your own behavior. In fact, we have a number of studies where we've had the alter self-reports and ego's perceptions of what alter does, and it's the perceptions that matter more than the ego self-reports. And it turns out people aren't particularly great at estimating other people's behavior. We also know that so-called Somalian ties increase interpersonal influence, right? So A and B, if they're connected to one another, have a stronger influence on ego than other alters in the network. And of course, more globally, we know from Ron Burt's work that if you have a network filled with alters that are connected to one another, you're in a highly constrained situation, and that will also accentuate the influence that your network has on your behavior. And there's some evidence, although it's mixed, about the role of strong versus weak ties, right? So the thought has always been that stronger ties are going to be more strongly associated with behavioral influence than weak ties, right? And I also argue that the more consequential the behavior, the more that tie strength matters, right? So if I'm making a simple behavioral decision, I can get influenced by people I'm not particularly strongly connected to. But when I'm making big decisions, buying a car, buying a house, things like that, making big changes, strong ties matter. And the evidence is mixed on the role of indirect influences, right? I argued in my 95 book that it could go out 2 steps, and that you weighted those indirect influences by the inverse of the geodesic that connected them. Somebody 2 steps out would have half the influence, and so on. Christakis and Fowler argued for 3 steps. I've never really felt comfortable with that because it's hard to believe. I don't even know who the friends of my friends are, let alone whether or not they can influence me. And then, of course, we can weight those alters by other network characteristics, right? If you have a closed system, you can calculate everybody's centrality measure, and you can then weight the network influence by those centrality measures. In degree seems logical. I do a lot of work with adolescents, and so you might think that popular students would have stronger influence on ego than less popular ones. And thanks to Ron Burt, he pushed the structural equivalence argument, right? So where we say that you're influenced by those to whom you are structurally equivalent. The mechanism for that is sometimes considered to be competition, right? You think about 2 firms, they're in the same position in the supply chain, and the customers they serve, they're structurally equivalent, and so that influence may transmit along that line. And I like to say that the minute McDonald's started giving out Happy Meals, Burger King needed to do something at the same time, right? So these indirect exposures mean that we can actually expand or contract the sphere of influence. So when Ron Burt did his structural equivalence work, he actually found a weighting that worked comfortably for him for getting that influence. So we think about expanding or contracting that influence along a number of dimensions. And then, of course, my own discovery of social network thresholds, right? So it turns out when I was analyzing the medical innovation data, there was not a contagion effect. And I was scratching my head trying to figure out what the heck is going on here. You know, I'm going to try to defend my dissertation in a couple months. My advisor thinks that there's this network effect that's happening. I can't find it in the data. I'm probably not going to get a dissertation, and I may need to go become a bartender in the Bahamas or something. But then I said, no, wait a second. We can't wait until everybody in our network does something, because then nothing would ever adopt. There have to be some people who are willing to adopt when none or a minority of their network is willing to do so. And those are the low threshold adopters. I am a high threshold adopter. Why am I a high threshold adopter? Because I'm smart, right? Why would I do something before anybody else is doing it? I'm going to wait until other people have it. The price goes down. When it breaks, they can tell me how to fix it, so on and so forth, right? And to demonstrate that physically, I have an iPhone 6, okay? Just think about that for a second. And this is a map of what thresholds look like, right? So traditionally in diffusion work, you would find your early adopters here, right? And then your late adopters. And what the threshold concept says is, well, there are some people that are early relative to their network and other people that are late relative to their network. And one of the reasons you have some late adopters is their position in the network makes it such that they don't hear about and learn about the innovation until much later in its diffusion. And then, of course, we have online influences. Data suggests that you can be influenced by those online connections. The influence is weaker than IRL in real life. Who's hip? Yes. But it tends to be smaller, but you can, of course, be connected to a lot more people. And then you can weight influences by joint participation in events and activities, right? People, adolescents who are on the same teams or the same clubs are more likely to influence one another than those that are on different ones. And then you can weight them by alter attributes, right? Communication theory says that people are more likely to be influenced by those to whom they have homophilous ties, share characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, political orientation, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things I've been digging into a little bit lately is thinking about the influence and susceptibility, right? So here's a little toy network that I use to illustrate this concept. You have 8 nodes. Their times of adoption are there on the in the table, and if you reformulate that data into something that looks like this, where the open circles are non-adopters, the closed ones are adopters, and their time of adoption is there, you look at person A, they've nominated, 5 other people, right? And so 3 of those that they nominated adopted before they did. So their threshold is going to be 3 over 5 or 60%. But you'll note that 2 of those people that he or she nominated, actually adopted in time 1. Whereas there's one person, person B, who adopted in the time period just prior to A's adoption. And so A is sensitive to B's behavior and not C and D's. So we say A is susceptible. Their susceptibility score is 1 over 3 rather than, or 1 over 5 rather than the threshold concept. And then we flip it the other way around. You look at person E. They're named by 6 other people. 3 of those others had already adopted before E did, but there's one person who adopted right after E, and so E is infectious to F, but not G and H, right? And so you can calculate this infectiousness and susceptibility across any network where you have these data, and you can also expand or contract that window over which you estimate the susceptibility and infectiousness, or the direction of the ties, depending on the kind of relation that you have. Okay, so that is the tour of how networks influence behaviors. And I oftentimes think of that as the work that I've done thinking about networks of behavior change. But the question you get asked, the question that I got asked a long time ago is, geez, if these networks are so important, what can I do with them, right? And so the idea is to say, let's think about how we use networks for interventions and program implementation. So a number of years ago, we published this paper, Social Network Analysis for Program Implementation. And basically, the implementation world uses the staged framework, not unlike many other fields. When we think about program development or evaluation, we always have these stages. And the common stage is this called EPIS, is what they call it, exploration, adoption of program, implementation, and sustainment and monitoring. And so at each one of these stages, there are network things that we can do, right? And the kinds of outcomes that we get from those stages are here in this row, and the classic citations for each one of these are there in the bottom row. And so we don't do enough of this, or at least we don't document that we do this a lot, which is to think about network ethnography, where we're trying to say, what is the network that's out there? Is there a network to work with? Who are the people that are providing input to program definition and design? Are there disconnected subgroups who are oftentimes out there that need our services or programs? And what about isolates, right? So I often thinking about the community as a network for program implementation. You're going to develop a program, and community-based organizations are always working with folks like this, where they're at the center of the network, and they think they know their network very well. But as we all know, and we know from Friedkin's work on the horizon of observability, we can't see very far into a network, right? So there are going to be parts of the network that are not connected and may need our services, and there are other subgroups in the network who in particular may be disconnected from the whole community and whom are not being brought into the design of the program. So this is just some BS about community as a network, and making explicit is important, and so on and so forth. So then when we move to program design or adoption, now we think about network interventions. And for me, this is where the real action is, right? And this work comes from a paper I published in Science back in 2012. And the idea is to think about purposive efforts to use social networks or social network data to generate social influence, accelerate behavior change, improve performance, achieve desirable outcomes among individuals, communities, organizations, and populations. Yeah, we can own the world if we do this, right? So, but before I launch into the specifics, there are a number of principles that I want to talk about that are important for all health promotion programs and behavior change programs, but I think they're particularly important. They're accentuated when we think about network interventions, right? So for one, the goals and objectives matter, right? That's obvious. We always talk about that in public health, but that's something that we do. And the reason I say that is depending on the goal that you're going to set up and how you think about doing it, that's going to have implications for what kind of network intervention you want to choose. And so I like to say network interventions are not agnostic to content. Behavior theory. Okay, so my bachelor's degree is in math. I didn't know anything about the social sciences. The only social science class I'd had as an undergraduate was economics and cultural anthropology, right? So I get into a master's program in communication, and I think theory, we can't talk. People are impossible to predict or understand. But I actually think over the past few decades that we've done a pretty good job. We know in public health what are the motivations for behavior change and what are the barriers. We have a pretty good idea how to do it. In fact, when we launch public health interventions, we're quite successful. And I'll return to this point much later on, I like to say a well-articulated theory of the behavior is often critical for successful interventions, and particularly when you're thinking about a network intervention, because you're going to want to generate some kind of influence that we talked about. And here's the other thing. To think about network interventions is to think about using them to learn from the community, not just induce change, right? When I started to develop this stuff back in the 1990s, I was like, this is great. I'm going to write an algorithm. I'm going to sell it. They're going to push the lever. Everybody's going to change. The money's going to come piling in. I'm going to be rich, famous, and have tenure. But that's really not the way it works, right? What you really want to do is set yourself up for working with the community, sharing the information, learning from them about what's working, and so on. And related to that is to think about this as an iterative process. Again, it's not a one-shot deal. Here's how you do it. Here's the manual. You're done. There's a process where you're interacting regularly with the community. So here's the table. This is a very popular table. I didn't realize how popular this table was going to be when I first created it, but it really is, I call it a taxonomy of network interventions. One of the reviewers would not allow me to say that. They didn't think it was taxonomic, and maybe it's not. But the best way to think about this, this table is we're breaking it down into strategy, which is the broad thing that you do. Each strategy has a tactic, and each tactic has operationalizations. And you hear that a lot when we're in political campaign season, right? What's the Biden strategy? What's the Harris strategy? What's the Trump strategy? Now, the easiest way to think about this and the most common is along this very top row, where typically our strategy is to identify individuals to be change agents. We're going to recruit them, and they're going to promote what it is that we want them to promote. And most of the time, if you think about doing that, you're going to identify leaders, right? You want to find the leaders in the organization, in the community, or wherever it is that you're working. But now you know from network analysis that we have lots of ways to identify the most central node in a network. Degree centrality, closeness centrality between this eigenvector power. You saw Scotch's periodic table of centrality measures yesterday. There's a million of them out there. Right? So this is actually what we do most of the time. We say, well, let's find those opinion leaders. It's easy to measure. It's intuitively appealing when you go into an organization and say, hey, boss, I'm going to get this network analysis stuff done and find who the opinion leaders are, and you're going to discover how important you are, and then we're going to bring about change. And then, of course, you do the data, you collect the data, and the boss isn't the most important person, and then they get all pissed off and kick you out of the room, but they still pay you your consulting fee, right? But it's been proven to be very effective. And in fact, when we did our review of the way we use opinion leaders in public health back in 2007, we identified over 20 studies that had used network data to identify peer opinion leaders and have them be change agents. And I thought, heck, and this really frustrated me because what I had done is created this table, right? We scanned the literature, did all kinds of searches and whatnot. And as we were doing that, I was writing the discussion section for the paper. And the discussion section basically said, we do this kind of stuff all the time in public health. We never do this, right? But if we did this, we'd have more valid and reliable opinion leaders and we'd be more successful. Well, I had to trash that discussion because by the time we got here, we had 20 studies that had done this, right? But the problem was this. You all know NIH, right? And NIH is organized by organ or disease. So what you had is studies done in HIV, right? And you had studies done in vaginal birth after first C-section and using aspirin to treat myocardial infarction and to treat kidney disease. They were spread all across the literature. None of them ever cited one another. So there wasn't this notion that this evidence had been accumulating, and it's there. We ran simulations. This is a cheap way to get a paper published, right? You take a bunch of networks, you seed them with opinion leaders versus those selected randomly versus those selected on the margins, and you get much faster diffusion if you start the seeding process with opinion leaders. And of course, this is a very popular notion these days that a lot of people are building on. But one of the reasons we wanted to look at this marginal condition is, in fact, many innovative ideas start on the margins of the network, right? People who are out on the periphery are free to innovate. The network's not doing anything for them, and they're not beholden to its norms and behaviors, and they may also be connected to other communities that are innovative in that way. So in fact, one of the things that takes diffusion such a long time is oftentimes it's people out here on the margins that adopt, and then it has to slowly percolate to the central people and then accelerate and spread. And a lot of people make the mistake and argue that opinion leaders are actually early adopters, but they only look like early adopters because once they adopt, it starts to spread rather rapidly. Floodgren did this nice Cochrane review, 18 trials, identified a whole bunch of opinion leader interventions and compared them, looked at whether or not they compared to control groups or other interventions. And what they get is a 12 percentage point increase in outcomes. Now that's huge. I teach program evaluation, right? And when we look at the effectiveness of our public health interventions, they're generally around 3 to 5 percentage points, which is a lot. You know, if Coca-Cola got 3% every time it launched a campaign, they would be dominating the world. So that is a big effect. 12 percentage points is huge. For those of you that are comfortable with power analysis, if you have an intervention that's giving you a 12 percentage point change, you only need to interview 10 people to find out that your network or your intervention is effective, right? So once you see this, you say, why isn't every medical care organization, hospital, business, using network analysis on a regular basis in order to improve their outcomes and have evidence-based behavior change? Now, I'll tell you a secret. So back in the 90s, you know, I have a brother that ran 15 restaurants in Atlanta, right? And he had to updo the wine list for all these restaurants, you know, every 6 months or so. And I was explaining to him about doing this opinion leader stuff, and he says, man, that's a great idea. I'm doing that. Now, did he run a randomized controlled trial? No. Did he collect data and help me publish a paper that would be real sexy? No, right? Because people in the business world do this stuff all the time without waiting for evidence. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, the easiest and dumbest thing you can do with network data is calculate in degree centrality, right? It's in a matrix, it's in your Excel spreadsheet, you sum the columns, and you're done. But that's exactly what we do. It's easy to calculate, it's easy to explain, you don't symmetrize your data, you can compare your in degree scores with other centrality measures, closeness, degree, betweenness, and so on, and also with your key player analysis. So why are opinion leaders so effective? Well, it turns out if you look at the 5 most popular individuals in the network, right, they have 37% of the incoming ties. An average selection of 5 people have an incoming rate of 10.5% of the incoming ties. So your opinion leaders, right, have 3.5 times as many connections coming to them as everybody else in the network. So once they adopt, they're accelerating all that interpersonal influence that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. So the other advantage about in-degree centrality, it's very robust to missing data, right? And most of the time when you're working in the field, you have missing data. You may have a lot of data. In the work that we did back in the early 2000s, we showed that you could have a response rate as low as 20 or 30% and still validly and reliably identify the most central nodes in the network. And of course, the more centralized the network, the lower your response rate can be and still identify the most central nodes. It's supported by prior work, it's supported by simulation, and the other advantage to it, and we've had to do this in the field, let's say you're going to do, okay, I'm going to get a network, I'm going to go ahead and take the top 10% of individuals and have them be my change agents, but some of those people leave, or some of those people don't want to do it. Now I can go down my list another 2, 3, 4% in order to find those that are most central. You can't do that with other centrality measures. Now, the place where there's a lot of science waiting to be done, and I think it eventually will be done, is what happens after you identify these opinion leaders, right? Do you have them schedule one-on-one meetings? Do you have them give formal presentations, grand rounds, have them call a meeting, and so on? So there's a continuum here of very passive versus very active activity by the opinion leaders that may have impacts on how effective they are. And for some people, that's the fun part, right? Making bells and whistles that they can use in order to accelerate behavior change. So the next tactic, of course, is maybe identifying bridging nodes. Now, in our field, we have been obsessed with identifying central members and coming up with centrality algorithms, right? I get to pat myself on the back for introducing a closeness centrality algorithm, which I think actually does better than the one that everybody uses, and we've shown it does better, so you should actually use that one rather than the other one. But that's neither here nor there. But the other thing that we should think about is bridging individuals, right? It may be many cases where bridging individuals are important to identify. You've got 2 different companies that are merging. Who are the bridges that you need to strengthen between them? Or different divisions in an organization, and so on and so forth. So the other thing, of course, as we know, and Jim alluded to this yesterday when we think about diffusion, you have diffusion within clusters, but it's getting it across the clusters where it slows down. And so the bridging people can be quite helpful in that regard. And we also make the comment that bridging may be less burden than leaders, right? Leaders are constrained in what they can do because of their position of leadership, whereas people who are in bridging positions actually are more open to different ways of doing it, and they may be more amenable to change. How do you identify bridges? Well, I also get to pat myself on the back because 2 of the 3 sociometric bridging measures are ones that I've developed with Kaio Fujimoto in 2010, and then Martin did some really good math in 2016 for that one. Then, of course, Bert's structural holes, which we've alluded to a little bit before, the inverse of constraint. So it may be that identifying bridging individuals is a good way to accelerate behavior change. Now, that's never been done, okay? There's no evidence that that works or how you would do it. We only think, that it would be a good idea. And I like to say some of the things that I come up with here are unconstrained by data, which is really convenient. as it were. Identifying isolates or peripheral individuals. There may be interventions where that's important. We know that sometimes people who are isolated are at risk for certain conditions. And then if you can identify your low threshold people, using them to start the contagion or the spread is a good idea, right? They're already used to adopting before their peers adopt, and they can get the ball rolling, as it were. Okay, so how do you do an individual intervention? You collect your network data, you identify opinion leaders or some other change agents, you recruit them as champions, and here's where you run into a problem, right? You've got to go out and buy a sledgehammer and hit them over the head and say, this is what we're supposed to be doing, and you need to get on board to do it. Now, some people say, well, what if they're resistant? Well, if they're resistant, you're not going to get anywhere anyway, right? You've got to get the buy-in from leadership, from the network perspective, in order to be successful bringing about change. And then here's where the fun comes in and goes back to that principle of iteration and learning rather than just trying to induce change. Now you work with them, right? What's working? What kinds of persuasive messages are you putting out there that you think people are resonating with? Are you seeing change as things progress along? Now, segmentation interventions, again, unconstrained by evidence or data, but there are many cases in which we want to create interventions that are delivered and consumed within a group all at the same time, right? So sometimes in business settings, for example, if you're going to change software that everybody's going to use, everybody needs to do it at the same time. And there are a number of kinds of behaviors, particularly interdependent behaviors, that are particularly appropriate for segmentation interventions. And we've got a whole bunch of different ways, again, in the network analytic community to identify groups, people that are more strongly connected to one another than they are to everybody else, community detection algorithms, and so on and so forth, right? So we have all of this stuff, components, cliques, and so on. And I was particularly pleased with when Gervin and Newman introduced their community detection algorithms, because it provided a way to create mutually exclusive groups. And if you're going to do an intervention, that's what you have to have. And then my friend George Vegayan made this very nice diagram illustrating that networks are oftentimes quite modular. So again, implementation issues, once you're doing this kind of intervention, a bunch of things are going to come up, right? Do groups need to be the same size? When we've done this in schools, we generally have groups be the same size. In organizations, not so much. And then bringing in the socio-demographic characteristics, do they need to be homogeneous or homophilous, or can they be heterogeneous, and so on and so forth. So the third strategy, and really the one that I think is the most interesting, is induction, right? Where strategies 1 and 2 really think about the network in a somewhat static perspective, where strategy 3 really uses the network structure. It tries to tap into that dynamic, right? They activate the network, try to accelerate change on it, right? And the oldest one of these we have is one that advertisers have been using forever, this notion of trying to get word of mouth, right? You want to get people to talk about your product. That's why they have, ads that are super sexy and real exciting, and it doesn't, not till the end of the ad that you realize what it is that they're advertising, because they want you to get engaged and share that with other people. And the reality is now we can do that stuff online, right? If you buy tickets through StubHub or SeatGeek or something like that, you can automatically post that to your social media feeds so everybody knows you're going to a football game or a concert or what have you. And then we learned a little bit about respondent-driven sampling the other day, right? And that's been used in an intervention context. Just participating in an RDS does create a situation where you're being exposed to behaviors and so on, and healthcare services. In fact, many IRBs will not allow you to do an RDS among, people with AIDS or people who inject drugs, unless you have some educational component tied to that activity, right? And then there's the respondent-driven sampling website, and lots of studies that have used RDS in an intervention capacity. And then outreach. And we'll learn a lot about this from Carl Latkin this afternoon. He's the one who's done this work the most. It's similar to RDS, but you're actually going to recruit people to bring their network in and participate in the intervention together so that the intervention lessons are reinforced by the personal network. And then the idea that we came up with, which I thought was so clever. I have to say that, I've had about 2 or 3 good ideas in my career, and I'm like, that's awesome, right? And this was one of them, where it's like, okay, we're going to identify opinion leaders, bless you. Now, but let's not just identify them. Let's think about who it is that is connected to them, right? And this really emphasizes the localness and the homophily of leadership, right? And it builds on naturally occurring networks. So, for example, you can take a network like this. Here's a network. Here are the people who receive the most nominations, right? And then rather than just say, okay, go out there and change everybody's behavior, let's make a map, right? And have leaders assigned to the individuals who have nominated them or who closest to them sociometrically. So we came up with this idea in the 90s, and then when I was recruited to USC, they were launching a tobacco prevention program in schools. And they were going to compare a culturally based tobacco prevention program with a standard social influences one. The group I work with has done substance abuse and substance abuse interventions for decades and very well known in that area. And the idea was to test this culturally tailored program in these middle schools and collect data through the middle school years. And so we were basically going to test these conditions. Now, the way this work had always been done in schools is teachers were told to put the roster of the classroom up on an overhead or somehow display it, have the students write down the 5 names of those they would like to work for a project in class. The teacher would gather all those pieces of paper, tally them up, and identify the opinion leaders. And then she did 2 things, which I don't blame her for, but I was really upset about. When the first is, she edited the list, right? So like when I was in school, I would have been on that list, and the teacher would have said, there's no way in hell I'm letting Tom Valente lead a group in a project. He's going to make a mockery of my class. And the second thing she did, of course, was throw the papers away and get rid of the data. And it's like, no, that's network data, So I was able to convince our team that we're going to do it my way. They're going to tally up the data. They're not going to edit it. And we're going to go ahead and, within the overall study, compare these implementation conditions, right? Opinion leaders and groups formed randomly, the way it's always been done. Have the teachers decide who the leaders and group members are, and then use this network algorithm that we had written. And full stop, confession, I'm not good at math, I'm not good at computer science, and so the algorithm was lousy, but that's all we had at the time. And so we did the study, and it turns out that when it comes to whether or not you like the program, just being in the network condition was associated with liking the program more, thinking your friends liked it more, and not liking the curriculum more. But remember, there's 2 different curricula there, so it's not surprising we didn't get a result there. And then we did the statistical analysis, and it turns out, again, just using the network condition was associated with better smoking attitudes, self-efficacy not to smoke, and a huge reduction in susceptibility to smoke, which we know is highly associated with smoking. And when we looked at the 1-year outcomes on smoking behavior, what we discovered is that overall, flavor was more effective than chips. Culturally tailored works better than not. Great. Everybody else in the department was happy. I didn't care. I was more interested in this. That in our random networks, random groups, flavor was less effective. But in the network and teacher identified ones, it was more effective. And it turns out what they meant by culturally tailored was you met in groups after school and created a skit or a play that was reflective of your cultural background. And so the groups that were actually more ethnically homophilous and more composed of friends were more effective at doing this in that kind of intervention. So I wrote up these results, sent the paper off to the Journal of School Health, talked about how great teachers are doing this, and it got rejected right away. And I went, oh, come on, people, I'm talking to your people. But we got it published nonetheless. Okay, so anyway, the network condition was the most appealing, reduced pro-tobacco attitude, susceptibility, but network effect was dependent on curriculum, right? And curriculum is effective, it contextually matters. And I think Jim alluded to this yesterday, that who you consume products with, whom you go to movies with, for example, is going to affect how you feel about it, right? There are implementation issues. This is stuff that we had to do pretty quickly, right? We had to have those assignments done right away and get the data fed back right away. And we have had concerns about confidentiality. The teacher's like, oh, we have all these names floating around. Is this okay? And I'll tell you a quick side story. So we did a replication of this, which I won't share with you. But then we also tried another replication that was not funded. And, you know, a couple of the teachers came back again with that concern. You know, these are kids sometimes that are leading the groups that I don't think should be leading them. But again, from a network perspective, that's the subgroup that you may actually want to need to work with the most, right? And so halfway through the project, one of the teachers sent us an email and said, oh my God, you know, Tommy led this group and I was so concerned because he's always such a mess up, a kid that's always goofing off. But he was wonderful. His group did absolutely the best. And I'm like, yes, see, all these self-fulfilling prophecies. When you think kids are going to be bad, of course they're going to be bad because you're expecting them to be bad. I remember when I walked into my ninth grade math class. I was, at the time, lived in a small town in New Jersey. And the teacher immediately sat me on one side and two of my friends in different places. Because he had had our older brothers in class and he knew what kinds of kids we were, so he's separating us, right? So I was patting myself on the back and saying, see, we don't trust these kids. But then, of course, 2 weeks later, we got another email with exactly the opposite thing, right? Tommy led his group, and I knew he was going to do this bad stuff, and he was terrible. So, you know, the jury's out on whether or not it works. And then finally, strategy 4 is alteration, right? And originally I called it manipulation, and I realized that did not sound very good. Let's act more like we're tailors, so we're just making things just a little bit better. And we've got different flavors of this, right? You can delete or add nodes to a network, you can delete or add links to a network, or you can rewire an entire network based on some properties. And how you do this, of course, is you calculate some kind of network metric. I like cohesion, the inverse of the average path length. You could use other things. And then you delete a node, recalculate the metric, calculate the difference, and the nodes with the largest difference are the most important. And in the literature, this is referred to as vitality centrality, and Everett and Borgatti call it induced centrality. And then you can do the same thing with links, right? You can add links or delete links, calculate a metric, calculate the difference, and then links with the largest difference are the most important ones, right? Whether you want to delete them or add them, okay? And you can do this for any network, and you calculate all of these differences, and then you put those differences into a matrix. And this is another way to do global network analysis, right? We can take a whole bunch of network metrics, toggle all the links, stack them up into an array, and start to analyze them and see what they say. Okay. The problem is we don't really know which structural networks to maximize and whether or not changing links, if you delete one, you have to add one and so on. And we really don't have a lot of experience with trying to, do this kind of work in naturally occurring settings where you have network dynamic processes happening, people entering and leaving the network, changing affiliations. And in fact, some people argue that any network you look at is the way the network is going to be because it's based on a whole bunch of individual choices, as we've talked about from the stochastic actor-oriented or ERGM framework. So rewiring networks is going to be rather difficult. I could only find one study that had actually done it, and they did it by moving kids in a classroom. There are a lot of organizations that would like to do this, and I suspect that they do it sometimes, but probably not a whole lot of evidence is out there about whether it works or not, and so on. And then we can, of course, rewire the networks to have some kind of global properties, try to make them more centralized or more small world or more clustered or so on and so forth. And then I like to also say one of the things that we do is rewire networks to match users with non-users, right? And teachers do this a lot. They'll match kids specifically high and low capability in order for them to help one another through their schoolwork or other activities that they're working on. And then finally, I like to chastise us, right? I like to say, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about how all the other social science fields ignore relations and ignore network structure, but we also have to acknowledge that nodes are people, right? They actually have attributes that we might want to consider. And you'll notice that a lot of all the stuff that I've just presented has actually been completely absent of individual attributes, right? And acted as if all the nodes are the same. And they're not. So anyway, so this is just back to this table. Like I said, it's become used in a number and expanded in different ways. So this is really still ongoing work. There's an R program that you can use at your apparel. Again, like I said, I'm not the greatest programmer, but I put it all into an R script. So then we move on to the next stage of implementation. You're launching an intervention, people are meeting in groups, they're trying to get things done, and a number of years ago, and I alluded to this yesterday when I made the comment about the paper that we did on network diagnostics, right? This intervention was going on with folks at Vanderbilt University, Sherry Barkin and Sabina Giselle, and they had this idea, what can we do from a network perspective to actually think about when an intervention is happening, can we make changes to it? And so I came up with this table. These would be our kind of network metrics, a lot of standard ones that we're familiar with, and we'll go ahead and set some threshold values that the interventionist can be aware of. We gave them a diagram and suggestions about very specific things to do. And I'm pleased to say there's actually a fairly large trial of this that is just getting launched in New York in some South Asian housing units. So, I've talked about networks quite generally. In fact, one of the things that we know is that different networks serve different functions, right? One of the things I love, we get asked a lot of times, how do you calculate validity and reliability for network data? And the reality is we can. It's not standard psychometric stuff, but we know when we ask different network questions, we get different people, right? And typically for intervention purposes, the two networks that we measure the most are advice seeking and discussion, right? This goes all the way back to Coleman, Katz, and Menzel in the 50s. Who do you go to for advice? Who do you discuss matters with, right? And in the health care setting, we ask, who do you go to for advice when you have a clinical question about X? Who do you discuss your patient management issues with, and so on? And those different networks may suggest different kinds of network interventions and tactics. And I like to say one of the things that we find with our data is people that are high and low on these two dimensions, right? We find people that are very high in expertise but low in trust, right? We know they know a lot, but we don't know necessarily that they have the community or our own best interests at heart. And what's golden is when you find people that are here, high in expertise, high in trust. And I generally like to think about this as expertise is more hierarchical, where discussion and trust is more vertical. And we have evidence for that, right? That you're going to move up the food chain when you're looking for advice and across when you're looking for people that you trust. And I like to say that when the barrier is technical, you don't know how to do it, then advice seeking is going to be important and expertise. But when the barrier is cultural, we don't know what kind of change we want to do. We just know things aren't working well, then trust is going to be important. All right, so these network methods I think are fantastic. It's great to use them for interventions. It capitalizes on interpersonal relations. It uses the community as part of the change, right? And in my mind, any community and organization should be doing this on a regular basis because you're establishing a learning organization. You're building social capital within the community to bring about change. And one of the reasons network interventions are so successful is because the change stays there, right? We've seen in interventions out in the field, we can do an intervention for 3 months, throw a lot of money at a problem and get change. Great, that's fantastic. Then we go away and go do something else, write a new grant, find a new job. But when you use a network intervention, you're leaving the people in the community there to continue doing the health promotion activities you've trained them to do. So it's more sustainable and you have more long-lasting effects. I also think it can be replicated, and we can look at fidelity measures that we get. How well did we identify who the peer opinion leaders are? How well does our community detection algorithm characterize the network so that we know those group definitions are important? And then, of course, for us, data, right? This is a great excuse to have network data that we can analyze. Okay, I did that quickly because I only had an hour, but I'm happy to field some questions in the time that we have left. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
We'll do a little bit of a switch over. We'll come answer questions.
Yes, Anthony.
Thank you for the great talk. Can you go back to the taxonomy of network intervention?
Sure. Oh, there we go. Thank you for calling it taxonomy.
How do you decide which of these strategies to implement? Is it led by community? Do you like elicit it from them? Is it led by network structures?
So I've got some writing on this. One of the things, of course, is there a network out there? Because if there isn't, you've got to start with building the network and so on. The reality is everybody loves this. Every time I go into an organization or a community, it's like, no, let's just identify the peer opinion leaders and work with them. That makes the most sense. It's easy and intuitive and whatnot. Frankly, I think the ones that are the most effective are down here, right? And what I like to do is start here, but then switch over to here. But again, it's the community that gets to decide. You're going to work with them, and whatever motivates them and appeals to them is the way you want to go, because they know their own community better than you do. You're just there to provide the tools and the assistance to get it done. So you want to lead it to them. And there's a process of teaching them about network analysis, right? You go in, community meeting, you say, oh, we do all this stuff. And they're like, wow, that's fascinating, that's amazing. And then, they either get more enthusiastic or not. But you let them lead the charge.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
I'm wondering, could you speak a little bit about what you've seen in terms of network interventions across boundaries, like across services, organizations, or communities?
Right, and so unfortunately, everybody says that their network is unique. So whatever they're doing here is, when I come and say, oh, we did this over here, they go, yeah, but they're different than we are. We have our own culture here, so we need to do it differently here, even though it ends up being exactly the same thing, right? And so you don't get a lot of bleed over. And frankly, the biggest challenge we've had, and I've been in a lot of organizations where this has been the case, they say, this is great, let's do this. You collect the data, you show them the data, and inevitably there are some things in the data that they don't agree with, so they discount the data, right? Because they always, you have your management team there, and not everybody on the management team ends up high on the list of centrality measures. And so they go, well, clearly the data are wrong, right? And then they'll look for one mistake in the data and say, discount it. And so we have the same problem getting network interventions adopted as we do with other innovations, right? Why we don't get lift on this is shocking to me. Because again, you can get a 14 percentage point change within a year in an organization, and you're talking primarily these are doctors who are not easy to change, and sure enough, it's not happening, and it's surprising. Now, one of the reasons it's not happening is people are happy to do things the way they've always done them, right? And that's just human nature, and it's hard to get behavior change. Yes?
You're gonna lose your slides now.
Yes?
A bit of a data sharing issue, but is there have you done or are you familiar with work that has used prior network data to kind of plan and implement interventions?
I'm not familiar with anybody that's done that, and I guess you'd be unsure how valid the data were, how stable they are. And the thing is, it's so easy to collect network data. So I review papers all the time. I'm editor of a journal. People always, network data is so hard and expensive to collect and process and whatnot. But frankly, it's easy to collect network data, right? I've gone into organizations allowed people to name up to 12 alters to half a dozen or 8 different network questions, and it takes less than 5 minutes, right? Because we can preload that stuff into Qualtrics or RedCap or Network Canvas, and so it takes them no time at all. So I don't have any problem collecting data, and have not used any existing data or know of anybody who has tried to do that. Although, I mean, you could imagine there are settings where there's network data all around us anyway, so you could do that. Although I have some critiques about electronically, unobtrusively collected data, because it doesn't always tell you what you want it to tell, right? So for example, there are a lot of companies that go to pharmaceutical companies and say, here, I'm going to get all this network data via shared patients and other kinds of undirected data. But the key to good network intervention data is directed data, right? That direction matters a lot. Who's receiving the nominations? So, yeah. Yes?
This might be a bit too meta of a question, maybe saved for later in the day, but you do a lot of work with adolescents, and I wonder what your thoughts were about just like these two dual contexts, the in-person and the digital context. And it feels like every year the Pew Center does their research report, the percentage of kids that are just constantly online keeps increasing, and the person who's popular in person might not actually be popular online, and all these different.
Yeah, I haven't done enough work to look at that, right? I mean, I do know from my own experience, having raised 2 kids, that the people that they're online with the most are ones that they're also friends with in real life. But you're right, the network does expand out from the school, and there's all kinds of very weak ties and long tie connections that they have outside of the school environment. But now that COVID's done, or at least we're in a new stage of it, kids are back in school, and it's still a primary place where they locate. But the other reality is any one of these interventions, where you may be working with the kids' social networks, there's going to be a social media or a media component that's going to be tied in. They're going to be sending messages over Snapchat, Instagram, and Discord, and everything else that they use, right? So there is a duality there, indeed. Yep. Yes, Miranda.
Last question.
Miranda.
Very quick.
Network generators. So I know discussion-based, advice-based networks we talked about with like Linear and things of that nature. But what are your network generators that you find are really good I guess contribute to intervention in public?
So advice and discussion work great. I've been working with some organizational folks who also like the network name generators. Who do you rely on? Who relies on you? Which is a nice innovation. I steer away from anything personal, right? We went into a hospital one time, and the folks wanted to ask, who are your friends and who do you have coffee with? And this was a mental health setting, and people are very sensitive to that. They're like, no, you don't need to know that, you know. So back off all those personal ones. And I think, frankly, you don't want to go down that road when you're doing the intervention content. Yeah. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.